American man helps Korean beggar woman, but is shocked to see her reality. The neon lights of Seoul shimmered against the backdrop of the darkening sky as Elliot stepped out of the bustling subway station. The hum of the city surrounded him, chaotic yet comforting symphony of hurried footsteps, muffled conversations, and the distant notes of a street performer's guitar. Seoul had become familiar in the past 6 months, but tonight felt different. Elliot wasn't rushing to a meeting or a dinner with colleagues. Instead, he carried a bag of freshly bought food, the contents still warm, as he made his way to the familiar corner by the station's entrance. There she was again, the woman who had captivated his attention for weeks now. Hunched on the worn blanket, her frail frame seemed to fold in on itself against the evening chill. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves around her face, and her clothes, loose and mismatched, spoke of a life lived without comfort. Her sign rested. In front of her, the Korean characters boldly stating her plea for help. Though Elliot couldn't read the exact words, he didn't need to. Her eyes, deep and sorrowful, told the story she didn't speak aloud. For a moment, he hesitated. Would she even accept his help? Would his presence embarrass her? The thought made his heart ache, but he couldn't walk away, not tonight. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice soft yet firm enough to catch her attention. Her head lifted slightly and her tired eyes met his. There was a flicker of surprise there, followed by something he couldn't quite place. Hesitation, perhaps. "I brought some food," he said, lifting the bag as if to offer proof of his intentions. She blinked, her thin fingers clutching the blanket tighter. "Food?" she murmured in halting English. Elliot nodded, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "Yes, it's warm." He placed the bag in front of her and stepped back slightly, giving her space. She stared at the bag for a moment before reaching out, her hands trembling. When she opened it and caught the aroma of the meal inside, her expression softened. Without another word, she began to eat, each bite careful and deliberate. Elliot sat down on the cold pavement a few feet away, watching her silently. He didn't want to pry, but the urge to know more about her was overwhelming. "What's your name?" he asked after a while, his tone gentle. She paused, looking up at him through a curtain of hair. "Hyejin," she said softly, her accent thick but her voice clear. "Hyejin," he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue awkwardly. "I'm Elliot." Her lips curved ever so slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "Elliot," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Encouraged, he continued. "Do you need anything else? Clothes? A blanket? I can help." Yejin's expression shifted, her gaze dropping to the ground. No need," she said quickly, her voice tinged with something that sounded like shame. Elliot wanted to say more, but he sensed that pushing her would only drive her away. Instead, he simply nodded. "Okay, if you ever change your mind, I'm here." For the next few nights, Elliot returned, always bringing something, a meal, a scarf, or a warm drink. Slowly, Hyejin began to open up, sharing pieces of her life, in fragmented sentences. "I was teacher," she told him one evening, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea he had brought her. "A teacher?" Elliot repeated, surprised. "What did you teach?" "Music," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "Piano." The image of Hyejin as a music teacher, a far cry from the woman sitting on the cold ground before him, stirred something in Elliot. He wanted to know more, to understand how she had ended up here, but her guarded demeanor kept him from prying too deeply. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, Hyejin looked at him with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "Why you help me?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes searching. Elliot was taken aback by the directness of her question. He thought for a moment before answering. "Because I want to. Because I see you here, and I can't just walk past without doing something." Her gaze lingered on him, and for the first time he saw the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes. "No one helped before," she said quietly. "Only you." Her words struck him deeply. How could someone so vulnerable, so clearly in need, have been ignored for so long? He felt a surge of protectiveness, a desire to do more for her. But everything changed the night he learned the truth. After weeks of visiting Hyejin, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. Her reluctance to accept help, her guarded responses, and the occasional flicker of fear in her eyes all hinted at something deeper. One evening, driven by a mix of concern and curiosity, Elliot reached out to a local contact, a colleague who was fluent in Korean and familiar with the city. He described Hyejin and her situation, hoping to find a way to help her more effectively. What he learned left him reeling. Hyejin wasn't homeless. She wasn't destitute. In fact, she came from a wealthy family and owned several properties in Seoul. Her life as a beggar was a choice, a deliberate escape from the pressures and expectations of her privileged background. Elliot spent the rest of the night wrestling with his emotions. He felt betrayed, confused, and yet, oddly, he couldn't bring himself to resent her. There had to be a reason, a story behind her decision to live this way. The next evening, when he approached her usual spot, he carried not just food, but also the weight of what he had learned. "Hyejin," he said softly, kneeling down beside her. She looked up at him, her eyes as weary as ever. "Elliot," she murmured, her tone warm despite the cold air. "I know," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "I know about your family, your wealth. Why didn't you tell me?" Her reaction was immediate. Her face went pale, and her hands clenched the edges of her blanket. How you know?" she stammered, her voice shaking. "I asked someone," he admitted. "I just wanted to help you. But now I'm even more confused. Why are you here, Hyejin? Why are you living like this?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a trembling breath, she began to speak. "I was not happy," she said, her words halting but sincere. "My family, they want perfect daughter, perfect wife, but I cannot. Too much." Her voice broke, and tears streamed down her face. "I run away. I leave everything. I want freedom. But freedom is lonely." Elliot's heart ached as he listened to her. He realized that her deception wasn't about malice or manipulation. It was about survival. "You don't have to live like this," he said gently. "You can find freedom without running away from everything. Let me help you for real this time." Hyejin looked at him, her tear-streaked face full of vulnerability. For the first time she nodded, a glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness in her eyes. As they sat together in the falling snow, Elliot knew that their journey was just beginning. Elliot didn't sleep much that night. Hyejin's story weighed heavily on his mind. The sight of her tears as she confessed her struggles stayed with him, filling him with a strange mix of sadness and determination. He understood now that Hyejin wasn't just a woman begging for food. She was a soul who had been lost in the labyrinth of life's expectations and found herself trapped by her own choices. The next day, Elliot made a decision. He wasn't going to let Hyejin slip through the cracks of the world any longer. If she truly wanted help, he would give it to her, but only if she let him. As evening fell, he walked to the subway entrance where she usually sat. But tonight, her blanket was empty, and her usual spot was deserted. Elliot frowned, a flicker of worry coursing through him. He stood there for a few minutes, scanning the area, before turning and heading to the nearby streets. After about 10 minutes of searching, he spotted her. She was sitting in a small park a few blocks away, her thin figure barely visible under the dim streetlights. She looked even smaller and frailer in the pale glow, huddled under the same worn blanket he'd seen her with for weeks. "Hyejin," Elliot called softly as he approached. Her head snapped up, her face a mix of surprise and relief. "Elliot," she said, her voice trembling. "You weren't at the station," he said as he crouched down beside her. "I was worried." Hyejin looked down, her fingers clutching the edges of the blanket. Too many people. Too cold, she muttered. Elliot nodded. I understand. But listen, I've been thinking about what you told me. If you're serious about wanting to change things, I want to help you. But you need to trust me. Her eyes met his, wide and uncertain. Trust. Hard, she said quietly. I know, Elliot replied. But you've trusted me this far. I just want to see you safe, Hyejin, that's all. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her blanket. Finally, she gave a small nod. Okay. What do I do? Elliot smiled gently, relief washing over him. First, we get you somewhere warm, a shelter maybe. Then we figure out the rest. Hyejin flinched slightly at the word shelter, her expression clouding with fear. No shelter, she said quickly. Please, no. Elliot frowned. Why not? It's safe and they can help you get back on your feet. Her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket tighter. People, they talk. They ask questions. I don't want... Her voice trailed off and she shook her head. Elliot sighed, realizing that pushing her wouldn't help. Okay, no shelter, he said gently. But you can't stay out here. Hyejin, it's too cold and it's not safe. She didn't respond, but the way her shoulders slumped told him she knew he was right. I have an idea, Elliot said after a moment. There's a small guest house near my apartment. It's cheap and the owner is kind. I'll pay for a few nights just until we figure out the next step. What do you think? Hyejin's eyes widened. You'd do that for me? Of course, Elliot said firmly. I told you I want to help. For a long moment she stared at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Then finally she nodded. The guest house was a modest building tucked away on a quiet street. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Kim, greeted them warmly, her eyes flicking curiously between Elliot and Hyejin. She needs a room, Elliot explained in Korean, his accent clumsy but his words clear. Just for a few nights, Mrs. Kim nodded, her kind eyes lingering on Hyejin. Of course, she said. Come this way. Hyejin followed Mrs. Kim silently, her steps hesitant as they climbed the narrow staircase. Elliot stayed close behind, ready to catch her if she stumbled. The room was small but clean, with a single bed, a wooden desk, and a small window overlooking the street. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, and a thick quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. This will do, Mrs. Kim said, smiling. If you need anything, just ask. Thank you, Elliot said, bowing slightly. Mrs. Kim left, and Elliot turned to Hyejin, who stood frozen in the middle of the room. She looked around slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. It's nice, she said softly. It's warm, Elliot said with a small smile. Hyejin nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the quilt. Thank you, Elliot, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to thank me, he replied. Just rest. You've been through a lot. She looked at him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. No one ever helped like you, she said. Elliot's chest tightened. Well, maybe it's about time someone did. He left her shortly after, giving her space to settle in. As he walked back to his apartment, he felt a sense of relief, but also a growing sense of responsibility. Hyejin had taken a small step toward trusting him, but he knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Over the next few days, Elliot visited Hyejin regularly, bringing her meals and helping her plan her next steps. Slowly, she began to open up more about her life. I was always good daughter, she told him one afternoon as they sat in a small cafe near the guest house. Good student, good teacher, but never me. What do you mean? Elliot asked, genuinely curious. Hyejin sighed, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. My family, they want perfect life, perfect husband. But I'm not perfect. I try, but I fail. So I leave. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the pain beneath her words. Running away must have been hard, Elliot said gently. It was, she admitted, but staying harder. Elliot nodded, understanding her struggle in a way he hadn't before. Hyejin wasn't just running from her family. She was running from a life that had suffocated her, a life that had left no room for her true self. You don't have to go back to that life, he said, but you don't have to live like this either. There's a middle ground, Hyejin. We just have to find it. She looked at him then, her expression thoughtful. You think I can find it? I know you can, Elliot said firmly, and I'll help you every step of the way. For the first time, Hyejin smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of small victories and quiet struggles. Hyejin began to rebuild her life, one step at a time. With Elliot's help, she found part-time work at a local cafe, where the owner was kind enough to overlook her lack of experience. I like it, she told Elliot one evening, as they walked through the park. It's small, but I feel useful. You are useful, Elliot said with a smile. You're doing great, Hyejin. She blushed slightly, her cheeks turning pink in the cold air. Thank you, she said softly. But not everything was easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when Hyejin wanted to give up and retreat back into the shadows. I'm not strong, she admitted one night, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this. Yes, you can, Elliot said, firmly, his voice steady. You've already come so far, Hyejin. Don't let fear hold you back. His words seemed to reach her, and she nodded slowly, wiping her tears away. Through it all, Elliot stayed by her side, offering support and encouragement. He didn't know why he felt so compelled to help her, but he didn't question it. All he knew was that Hyejin had become more than just a stranger to him. She was someone worth fighting for, and as he watched her take her first tentative steps toward a brighter future, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they were both on the path to something better. Elliot stood by the window of his apartment, staring out at the city below. The lights of Seoul blinked and shimmered, a stark contrast to the swirling thoughts in his mind. Over the past weeks, his life had become intertwined with Hyejin's, in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into something far more profound, more personal. He thought about her resilience, her small but steady steps forward. But he also thought about the weight she carried, the scars of her past that hadn't yet healed. Despite her progress, Hyejin still seemed haunted by something, a shadow she didn't talk about but that lingered in her eyes during quiet moments. The sound of his phone buzzing broke his thoughts. He picked it up to see a message from Hyejin. Hyejin, I want to talk. Can you come to the park? Elliot grabbed his coat and headed out into the crisp evening air. The park had become their unofficial meeting place, a quiet refuge where they could talk without the distractions of the city around them. When he arrived, he found Hyejin sitting on the same bench where he had found her weeks ago. She looked different now, healthier, with a lightness to her that hadn't been there before. But tonight, her shoulders were hunched, and her gaze was fixed on the ground. Hyejin, Elliot said softly as he approached. She looked up, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the nearby street lamp. There was a flicker of relief in her eyes when she saw him, but it was overshadowed by something heavier. Elliot, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for coming. Of course, he said, sitting down beside her. What's on your mind? For a moment she didn't speak. She fiddled with the hem of her coat, her fingers trembling slightly. Finally, she looked at him, her expression both vulnerable and resolute. There's something I need to tell you, she began. Elliot's heart tightened. He had sensed for a while that Hyejin was holding something back, but he hadn't wanted to push her. Take your time, he said gently. Hyejin took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak. Before I met you, I was in trouble, she said. Not just with my family, but with other people. Elliot frowned. What kind of trouble? She hesitated, her gaze darting away from his. I borrowed money, she admitted. A lot of money. After I ran away, I didn't have anything. No job, no place to stay. I was desperate. The words hit Elliot like a blow. Who did you borrow from? He asked carefully. Bad people, she said, her voice trembling. Loan sharks. They found me a few weeks ago, just before you started helping me. I thought I could hide from them, but they know where I am. Elliot's chest tightened. Hyejin, why didn't you tell me this sooner? I was scared, she said, her eyes glistening with tears. I didn't want to drag you into my mess. Elliot reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're not dragging me into anything, he said firmly. But you can't handle this alone. How much do you owe them? She bit her lip, hesitating before answering. 10 million won. Elliot's stomach dropped. It wasn't an insurmountable amount, but it was far more than Hyejin could hope to repay with her part-time job. Do they know where you're staying? He asked. She nodded, her expression one of quiet resignation. They came to the guest house today. Mrs. Kim told them I wasn't there, but they'll come back. Elliot clenched his fists, anger simmering just below the surface. He had seen enough during his time abroad to know how dangerous loan sharks could be. This wasn't just about money, it was about Hyejin's safety. We'll figure this out, he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. But first, you need to move. It's not safe for you at the guest house anymore. Hyejin's eyes widened. Move? To where? You can stay at my place, Elliot said without hesitation. Her expression shifted to one of shock. Elliot, I can't. You can, he interrupted. It's the safest option right now. I have a spare room and I won't let those people hurt you. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she shook her head. You've already done so. Much for me, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, Elliot said gently. I'm offering. Please, Hyejin, let me help you. She stared at him, her tears falling silently. After a long moment, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Thank you. By the time they reached Elliot's apartment, it was late. The city had quieted, and the only sound was the occasional hum of a passing car. Elliot showed Hyejin to the small guest room, which was sparsely furnished but clean and cozy. It's not much, he said, but it's yours for as long as you need. Hyejin looked around, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. It's perfect, she said softly. You should get some rest, Elliot said. We'll figure out the next steps tomorrow. She nodded, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Good night, Elliot. Good night, Hyejin, he replied, closing the door gently behind him. As he lay in bed that night, Elliot couldn't stop thinking about the situation they were in. He knew he had to find a way to help Hyejin repay the debt, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The loan sharks wouldn't just go away, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that they might have to confront them directly. But for now, all that mattered was keeping Hyejin safe. The next morning, Elliot woke early and found Hyejin sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. She looked up when he entered, offering him a small, tentative smile. Good morning, he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Good morning, she replied. They sat, in silence for a moment before Hyejin spoke. I was thinking, she said, maybe I can sell some of my things, the ones I left behind when I ran away. It might help with the debt. Elliot frowned. Do you still have access to them? I think so, she said. Most of it is at my family's house. They didn't throw it away. Her voice faltered, and Elliot could see the anxiety in her eyes. Do you think your family would let you retrieve them? He asked gently. I don't know, she admitted, but it's worth a try. Elliot nodded. If you want to go, I'll come. With you. Hyejin looked at him, her expression softening. You would do that? Of course, he said. You don't have to face them alone. A flicker of relief crossed her face, and she nodded. Thank you. As they prepared to leave, Elliot couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew this visit wouldn't be easy for Hyejin, and he could only hope that her family would be willing to help. The house was large and imposing, its traditional Korean architecture a stark reminder of the life Hyejin had left behind. Elliot could feel her tension as they walked up the driveway, her steps slow and hesitant. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her hands were trembling. "I think so." The door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman, in her 50s with sharp eyes and an air of authority. She froze when she saw Hyejin, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. "Hyejin," she said, her voice cold. "What are you doing here?" Hyejin hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I need some of my things," she said quietly. The woman, Hyejin's mother, Elliot realized, narrowed her eyes. "After everything you've done, you have the nerve to come back and ask for help?" Elliot stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "She's not asking for help, she just wants her belongings." Hyejin's mother glared at him, her expression hard. "And who are you?" "A friend," Elliot said evenly. For a moment there was silence. Then, with a huff, Hyejin's mother stepped aside. "Fine. Take what you want and leave. But don't expect anything more." Hyejin nodded, her movements stiff as she entered the house. Elliot followed, his presence a silent reassurance. As they gathered her belongings, Elliot could see the pain etched on Hyejin's face. This house, once her home, was now a place of judgment and rejection. When they finally left, Hyejin let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. Elliot placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me, Hyejin. We're in this together." As they walked away, Elliot couldn't help but feel a renewed determination. Hyejin's journey was far from over, but he was more committed than ever to helping her find the freedom and peace she deserved. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change, growth, and healing for both Hyejin and Elliot. Each step they took was hard-fought but rewarding, a testament to the strength they had found in one another. Slowly but surely, the weight of Hyejin's past began to lift, and the future she once thought impossible started to take shape. Elliot worked tirelessly behind the scenes to deal with the looming threat of the loan sharks. He enlisted the help of a trusted local lawyer, Mr. Min, who specialized in cases involving predatory lending. Hyejin was hesitant at first, fearing that exposing her debt to legal scrutiny would make matters worse, but Elliot convinced her to trust the process. "It's the only way to break free of them. Hyejin," he had said one night as they sat in the living room, "you don't have to face them alone. I'll be with you every step of the way." Despite her fears, she agreed. The case was complicated, but Mr. Min discovered that the loan sharks had violated several laws, including charging exorbitant interest rates that far exceeded legal limits. Armed with this information, Mr. Min filed a complaint with the authorities, setting off a chain of events that would eventually lead to the dissolution of the loan sharks' operations. During this time, Hyejin threw herself into her work at Mao, the cafe. Earning the respect and admiration of her colleagues, she began to save money, little by little, and even started taking night classes to improve her English and learn basic financial skills. Elliot helped her study, and their late-night sessions often turned into moments of shared laughter and quiet reflection. "You're really good at this," Elliot said one evening, pointing to the flawless grammar on her homework. "You don't even need me anymore." Hyejin smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her face. "I still need you," she said softly. "Not just for homework." Elliot felt his chest tighten at her words, but he pushed the feeling aside. His focus was on helping her build a life she could be proud of. Anything else would have to wait. The breakthrough came one chilly afternoon in early winter. Hyejin had just finished her shift at the cafe when her phone buzzed with a call from Mr. Min. "Good news," he said, his voice warm with excitement. "The court has ruled in your favor. The loan sharks are being prosecuted, and your debt is officially voided." Hyejin froze, the phone trembling in her hand. "What?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "You're free, Ms. Hyejin," Mr. Min said. "They can't hurt you anymore." She hung up the phone and sat down on the nearest bench, her heart pounding. For so long, the debt had been a shadow over her life, a constant reminder of her mistakes. Now it was gone, just like that. The relief was overwhelming, almost too much to bear. When Elliot came to meet her later that evening, she ran to him, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she said, her voice trembling. "The debt is gone." Elliot's face broke into a grin, and before he could think, he pulled her into a tight embrace. "I knew it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I knew we'd get through this." For the first time in years, Yejin felt like she could breathe, truly breathe. With the debt behind her, Yejin began to focus on building a life she could call her own. She moved out of Elliot's apartment and into a small studio not far from the cafe, a space that was modest, but entirely hers. She decorated it with soft colors and warm lights, turning it into a sanctuary that reflected her newfound independence. Elliot helped her move in, carrying boxes up the narrow stairs and teasing her about her obsession with plants. "You've got enough greenery here to start a forest," he said, setting down a box filled with potted succulents. Yejin laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent and natural. "They make me happy," she said simply. "And they don't ask for much." Elliot smiled at that, his heart swelling with admiration for the woman she had become. She was still the Hyejin he had met months ago, but there was a strength to her now, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. One evening, as they shared dinner in her new apartment, Yejin turned to Elliot with a serious expression. "You've done so much for me," she said. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to repay me," Elliot said, his tone gentle but firm. "Seeing you happy and safe is enough." Yejin shook her head. "No, it's not enough. You've given me so much. Your time, your kindness, your hope. I want to give you something in return." Elliot looked at her, his heart racing. "You already have, Yejin. You've shown me what it means to care about someone, to fight for something that matters. You've changed my life as much as I've changed yours." Yejin's eyes softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Slowly, she reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "Then let me keep changing it," she said quietly. In the months that followed, their relationship deepened in ways neither of them had expected. What began as a bond of trust and friendship grew into something more, a connection rooted in mutual respect and an understanding of each other's struggles. They supported one another in ways that went beyond words, their lives intertwining in a way that felt natural and right. Hyejin continued to thrive, eventually earning a promotion at the cafe and even starting her own small side business, making handmade candles. Elliot, inspired by her courage and determination, began to pursue his own dreams with renewed vigor, taking on freelance writing projects that allowed him to explore his passion for storytelling. On a warm spring evening, as they walked through the park where their journey had begun, Elliot stopped and turned to Hyejin. The setting sun cast a golden glow over her face, and for a moment he simply marveled at the woman she had become. "Hyejin," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "You've shown me what it means to believe in someone, to fight for a better future. I can't imagine my life without you in it." She looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Elliot." He reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled, a smile that was bright and unshakable. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and clear. Together. As they stood there, hand in hand, the city bustling around them, it was clear that their story wasn't just about survival. It was about love, resilience, and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way forward, and for the first time in a long time, they both felt truly free.